Most home invasions don't start with a broken window. They don't start with a masked stranger, and they definitely don't start with someone kicking down your front door. They start with something so ordinary that most of us wouldn't even think twice about it. A knock. A single knock at the door. Tonight, you are about to hear 4 true stories from people who discovered that the person outside wasn't there by accident. In the first story, a man carrying a package keeps showing up at the same house night after night. But the package is fake, the delivery company doesn't exist, and the real reason he is there is far more disturbing. In the second story, a family spends weeks hearing mysterious knocks around their home. Then, on Christmas night, they wake up to discover the person responsible is already inside the house. In the third story, a mother notices a stranger in a bright yellow raincoat watching her family from the street. Days later, someone enters their home while they're sleeping just a few feet away. And in the final story, a series of knocks moves from one window to another, circling an isolated house in the snow. The terrifying part: the person inside may have looked directly at the intruder without ever realizing it. 4 homes, 4 strangers, and 4 nights that changed everything. So before we begin, take a second and ask yourself one question. If somebody knocked on your door tonight, would you answer it? Let's get into the first story. At the time this happened, I was living alone in a small rental house just outside town. It wasn't some isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere, but it definitely wasn't a busy neighborhood either. The house sat at the end of a short dead-end road with only a handful of homes nearby. Most nights were incredibly quiet. After dark, you could stand outside for 10 minutes and not see a single car drive past. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my routine was pretty predictable. Most days I barely left the house unless I needed groceries or had an appointment somewhere. I didn't get many visitors, and whenever friends stopped by, they always texted first. That is why the first knock immediately got my attention. It was a Thursday night around 8:45 p.m. I was sitting in the living room watching television when I heard 4 solid knocks on the front door. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm and deliberate. I muted the television and listened. For a moment, everything was quiet, then came 2 more knocks. I got up and walked to the door. There is a peephole in the center of it, so I looked through before opening it. Standing on my porch was a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He looked completely normal, mid-30s, maybe, dark jacket, baseball cap. Nothing about him immediately seemed suspicious. I opened the door but left the security chain attached. The guy immediately told me he had a package that required a signature. Then he looked down at a handheld scanner and read off a name. The problem was, it wasn't my name. It wasn't even close. I told him he had the wrong person. He looked confused and checked the scanner again. Then he read the address out loud. My address, exactly. I explained that nobody with that name lived there. For a few seconds, he just stared at me, not in an aggressive way, just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Finally, he said there must have been a mistake in the system and that he'd take the package back to his truck. I watched him walk down the driveway. That is when something struck me as strange. There was no truck, no delivery van, no car, nothing. He walked past the mailbox, reached the corner of the street, and disappeared from view. I locked the door and tried to brush it off. Maybe he worked for a small delivery company. Maybe he parked somewhere else. Maybe it was nothing. But the next night, at almost the exact same time, the knocking came back. 3 knocks. I didn't open the door immediately. Instead, I went straight to the peephole. My stomach dropped. It was the same guy, same jacket, same baseball cap, and the same cardboard box. This time I kept the door closed. I told him through the door that he'd already come by and that nobody with that name lived there. For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he calmly said he only needed a signature and that his system showed the package had to be delivered that night. I wasn't buying it. I told him there was no chance I was signing for somebody I didn't know. Silence. Then he quietly said, "Okay," but he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped back from the door and stood at the edge of my porch. I watched through the peephole as he slowly scanned the property. First the front windows, then the side of the house, then back to the front door. He wasn't looking for a customer. He looked like he was studying the place. After about 15 seconds, he finally walked away. Again, there was no vehicle anywhere. That is when the whole thing started feeling seriously wrong. Oddly enough, the third night came and went without any knocks. I actually felt relieved. I figured maybe he'd finally realized his mistake. Maybe I'd never see him again. I couldn't have been more wrong. On the 4th night, around 9 p.m., I was washing dishes in the kitchen when I suddenly heard 4 knocks. But this time they weren't coming from the front door. They came from the side of the house near the dining room window. Every hair on my arm stood up. I slowly walked into the dining room and looked toward the window. Nobody. Then immediately 4 more knocks. this time at the front door. I rushed to the peephole. It was him, but something was different. The cardboard box was gone. His hands were completely empty. I didn't say a word. Neither did he. He knocked again, then stepped backward and looked directly toward the peephole. It felt like he knew I was standing there watching him. I quietly moved away from the door and stayed silent. After about 30 seconds, he finally left. Or at least I thought he did. 5 minutes later, with all the lights off, I carefully checked the windows. Looking through the blinds, I spotted him standing across the street near the tree line, just standing there facing my house. Watching, after nearly a minute, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I called the local police non-emergency number. The officer I spoke with immediately took the situation seriously. He told me that burglars sometimes knock on doors to determine whether homes are occupied. If nobody answers repeatedly, they often come back later. His advice was simple: install cameras, keep your doors locked, and if the guy returned, call 911 immediately. That same night, I decided to stay completely out of sight. All the lights at the front of the house remained off. Around 8:45 p.m., right on schedule, 4 knocks echoed through the house. I didn't respond. A few seconds later, 4 more knocks. Then silence. About a minute passed. Then I heard something from the back of the house. A soft thud, then another. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and moved quietly into the hallway. That is when I heard it. The back doorknob slowly turning, stopping, then turning again. Somebody was trying to get inside. I immediately called 911 and whispered to the dispatcher. While I was explaining what was happening, the knocking started again at the front door. Suddenly, everything made sense. There wasn't just one person outside. There were multiple people, one at the front, at least one at the back, working together. The dispatcher told me officers were already on the way. Meanwhile, I could still hear the doorknob moving. Then came another sound. Metal lightly scraping against the doorframe. Someone was trying to pry the door open. For roughly 30 terrifying seconds, the noises continued. Then everything stopped. Complete silence. I stayed on the phone until police arrived. When officers searched outside, they discovered fresh pry marks near the back door handle. One officer looked at me and said something that still gives me chills. If you hadn't been home tonight, they probably would have gotten in. Police didn't locate anyone that evening. The following night, I stayed at my brother's apartment. Around 9 p.m., my neighbor called. Her voice sounded nervous. She told me a man had been standing on my porch knocking repeatedly for several minutes. I told her to contact police immediately. When officers arrived, they actually found him there. They questioned him on the spot. His story was ridiculous. He claimed he was trying to deliver a package but had somehow misplaced it. He couldn't provide company identification. He had no marked vehicle, and nothing about his explanation made sense. 2 days later, everything finally unraveled. Police arrested him in a nearby neighborhood while he was attempting to break into another house whose owner was out of town. Inside his vehicle, officers discovered multiple empty cardboard boxes and a handheld scanner. The scanner wasn't connected to any legitimate delivery company. The entire thing had been a scam. During questioning, he admitted exactly what he had been doing. He would approach homes carrying fake packages. If someone answered, he'd leave and move on. But if nobody answered after repeated visits, he'd assume the property was empty. Then he'd return later and force entry. He even admitted that he sometimes knocked on the same house for several nights in a row just to see if the pattern changed. The fake deliveries, the repeated visits, the scanning of my property, the empty box. Every bit of it had been part of the plan. 3 months later, I moved out of that house. To this day, I still think about how close I came to becoming a victim. And even now, years later, if someone knocks on my door unexpectedly after dark, I don't answer unless I know exactly who is coming. The first story proved that sometimes a knock on the door isn't random. But this next story is even more unsettling because the person behind the knocking didn't stay outside. By Christmas night, he was already inside the house. This happened near Glasgow, Scotland, during the weeks leading up to Christmas. At the time, I was living with my parents, my brothers and sisters, several cats, and a couple of dogs. Like most families around the holidays, our house was busy, noisy, and full of activity. Christmas decorations were everywhere, presents were slowly appearing under the tree, and everyone was excited for the holidays. Everything felt normal. Then the knocking started. One evening, a few days before Christmas, we were all sitting together watching Finny: A Christmas Carol. It was one of those cozy winter nights where everyone was relaxing indoors while the weather outside was cold and miserable. About halfway through the movie, we heard a knock at the front door. Nobody thought much about it. People knocked on our door all the time. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe a delivery, maybe somebody visiting unexpectedly. My mom got up and walked to the front door. A few seconds later, she opened it. Nobody was there. The street was completely empty. She checked around the side of the house. Nothing, no person, no car, no footsteps. Nobody. We laughed it off and went back to watching the movie. But then it happened again. A few days later, I was sitting at the dining table working on exam assignments when another knock echoed through the house. I looked toward the front door. Someone else answered. Again, nobody at first. We blamed neighborhood kids. In Scotland, there is a prank called Chappie, where kids knock on doors and run away before anyone answers. That explanation made sense. At least it did in the beginning. The problem was that the knocking kept happening. Every few days, somebody in the family would mention hearing it, sometimes during the day, sometimes late at night. Always the same result: a knock, an answer, nobody there. The moment that really bothered us happened one night, when my dad experienced it himself. Around 11:30 p.m., long after everyone else had gone to bed, he heard an unusually quiet knock. Not loud, not urgent. Just enough to get his attention. He walked to the front door and checked through the peephole. Nobody. He opened the door anyway. Still nobody. The street outside was completely silent. That was the first time I remember seeing my dad genuinely unsettled by it. And honestly, if my dad was uncomfortable, the rest of us were too. For weeks we had no answers. No explanation, no idea who was responsible. Then Christmas Day arrived, and everything went completely off the rails. After a long day of family celebrations, food, gifts, and relatives visiting, everyone eventually headed to bed. I went upstairs and lay down in my room. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. Then suddenly, I woke up. The digital clock beside my bed read 2:01 a.m. The house was silent. No television, no voices, no footsteps. Nothing. I remember lying there for a few moments, staring into the darkness. Then I heard it, knock. A faint sound somewhere in the house. I sat upright immediately. Every nerve in my body suddenly felt awake. For a few seconds, I listened. Silence. Then another faint knock. My heart started racing. Part of me wanted to stay in bed. Part of me wanted to know what was happening. Eventually, curiosity won. I slowly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark. As soon as I stepped into the doorway, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the staircase. Slow, uneven, heavy. At first I assumed it was my dad. Maybe he had heard the knocking too. But then I realized something wasn't right. The footsteps sounded strange, almost unsteady. Like whoever was climbing the stairs was struggling to keep their balance. Then I finally saw him. A man. A complete stranger. Already inside our house, I froze. The man staggered up the stairs looking heavily intoxicated. For a second, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. My brain simply refused to accept it. There was a stranger walking around inside our home at 2 o'clock in the morning. I quietly backed into my room and pulled the door almost shut. My hands were shaking. From the hallway, I could hear him moving around upstairs, opening doors, closing doors, walking into room after room. The realization hit me like a truck. My younger siblings were asleep in those rooms. I listened as he wandered through the hallway. Then I saw him emerge from my little sister's bedroom. That was enough. I sprinted straight to my parents' room. I burst inside and woke them immediately. At first they were confused. Then I explained there was a man upstairs inside the house. That got their attention fast. Within seconds, everyone was awake. Together we moved downstairs. And what we found was absolutely unbelievable. The stranger was stretched out on our couch, completely comfortable. Several of my dad's beers had been opened. The man looked like he had made himself at home. My mom immediately started shouting at him, demanding to know who he was, telling him to get out. The guy slowly woke up, and then somehow made the situation even crazier. He insisted the house belonged to him, not joking, not confused, actually insisting that he owned the property. The argument went nowhere. Eventually, my dad lost patience. He physically grabbed the man, lifted him off the couch, and dragged him toward the side door. After a struggle, they finally got him outside. The door slammed shut. Everyone stood there breathing heavily. We thought it was over. We were wrong. Seconds later, crash, glass exploded somewhere in the house. Everyone jumped. Then we heard shouting. We rushed toward the noise. The man had punched his fist straight through one of the windows. Blood covered the broken glass. He shoved part of his face through the opening and started screaming threats. His eyes looked wild, completely unhinged. He kept yelling that the house belonged to him, that he was coming back, that we couldn't keep him out. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Eventually, he stumbled away into the night. Police arrived shortly afterward. Fortunately, winter weather ended up helping investigators. Snow covered the ground outside, and because the man had cut himself badly on the broken window, there was an obvious trail of blood leading away from the house. Officers followed it down the street. The trail eventually led them to a nearby playground. There they found him lying on the ground covered in blood with pieces of glass still stuck in his hands. When police questioned him, the truth finally came out. Years earlier, he had actually lived in our house. According to him, he had gotten extremely drunk, become disoriented, and somehow convinced himself that he still lived there. That explained why he entered the property. It explained why he thought it belonged to him, but it didn't explain everything, not even close, because there was still one question nobody could answer. What about the weeks of knocking? The strange visits, the empty doorstep, the late-night knocks that happened before Christmas. Nobody ever figured that part out, and honestly, that is the detail that still bothers me the most. Because maybe the drunk stranger was responsible, or maybe someone else had been knocking all along. Either way, whenever I hear an unexpected knock late at night now, I still think back to that Christmas when the person knocking eventually ended up inside the house. The first story was about a man pretending to be a delivery driver. The second was about a stranger who somehow ended up inside a family's home after weeks of mysterious knocking. But this next story is different because it comes from the perspective of a child. And sometimes the things that terrify us when we're young stay with us for the rest of our lives. This happened around 2010 when I was about 6 years old. At the time, my family lived in a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Oregon. My dad was deployed overseas, so it was just my mom, my siblings, and me at home most of the time. I was still young enough that the world felt safe. Neighbors knew each other. Kids played outside. Nothing really seemed dangerous. That changed one night. It was late in the evening, and I was sitting outside on the front porch with my mom while she smoked a cigarette. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across the road. Everything felt completely normal. Then we noticed someone walking down the middle of the street. A man. He was wearing an oversized yellow raincoat. Even from a distance, something about him seemed off. He wasn't walking normally, he wasn't heading toward a particular house. He was just slowly moving down the center of the road. My mom watched him carefully. As he got closer, he suddenly stopped right beside the garbage cans at the end of our driveway. I remember feeling uncomfortable immediately. The man just stood there, looking toward our house. My mom didn't waste any time. She told us we were going inside. As soon as she started leading us toward the door, the man began yelling. I don't remember exactly what he was saying. I was too young. But I remember the sound of his voice. Loud, angry, aggressive. The kind of yelling that instantly makes your stomach drop. My mom hurried us inside. The second we entered the house, she locked the front door. Then she switched off the lights. Suddenly, the entire house felt different. What had started as an ordinary evening now felt like something out of a nightmare. Eventually, everyone went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. That night, I had one of the worst nightmares of my childhood. In the dream, the man in the yellow raincoat was standing outside my bedroom window. His face was pressed against the glass. Just staring, watching, waiting. The dream felt so real that I woke up shaking. My heart was pounding. For a few moments, I couldn't tell whether I was still dreaming or not. The house was dark. Silent. Everyone appeared to be asleep. I was terrified, so I woke up my older sister and asked her to walk me to the bathroom. She reluctantly got up and led me down the hallway. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then we heard it. Bang. A loud crash against the front door. Both of us froze. Then another. And another. The entire house seemed to shake. This wasn't somebody politely knocking. Whoever was outside was slamming their fists against the door with everything they had. My sister immediately ran to wake our mom. I remember hearing panic in her voice. My brother woke up too. Within moments, everyone was gathered together. Meanwhile, the banging continued over and over again. Each impact sounded louder than the last. Then came the yelling, the same voice. The same man. He was screaming outside the house, demanding to be let in. The words echoed through the darkness. As a 6-year-old kid, it was one of the most frightening experiences I had ever lived through. The worst part was feeling helpless. My dad wasn't there. My mom couldn't immediately find her phone. Nobody knew what to do. So we sat together on the floor, huddled close to one another, listening, waiting, hoping the man would leave. Every minute felt like an hour. Eventually, the banging stopped. The yelling faded away. Finally, after what felt like forever, the man disappeared. But none of us slept much after that. The feeling of fear stayed with us long after sunrise. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. at least on the surface. But only a few weeks later, something happened that made everything even worse. One morning, my family woke up and immediately knew something was wrong. The front door was standing open. Wide open. At first, nobody understood what they were looking at. Then more details started becoming obvious. One of the windows was open too, and the screen had been sliced. A large hole had been cut directly through it. Someone had entered the house during the night. While we were sleeping, the realization was horrifying. As my family checked room after room, we discovered items were missing. Random things at first, then more valuable things. One of the stolen items was my piggy bank. Another was a large decorative vase filled with cash and coins that my family had been saving for months. The money represented countless hours of work and saving. It was gone. But the detail that disturbed me the most wasn't what was taken, it was where it had been taken from. The vase had been sitting on my nightstand, right beside my bed, just a few feet from where I had been sleeping. At some point during the night, a stranger entered my room. Walked up beside my bed, reached over, and took it. Without waking me, without making a sound. That thought still sends chills down my spine. The intruder was never identified. Police never made an arrest. There was never any real closure, but the story doesn't end there. Sometime later, I noticed something strange. A neighbor who lived alone a short distance away had a large vase sitting on his porch. It looked almost identical to ours. Same shape, same size, same appearance. I can't prove it was the same vase, and I never had evidence, but seeing it there made my stomach turn, because it looked exactly like the one that had vanished from my bedroom. The neighbor kept mostly to himself. Nobody really knew him. Nobody really talked to him. And to this day, I've always wondered if there was a connection. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But after everything that happened, it never felt like one. Even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, one image always comes back to me. A man in a yellow raincoat standing beside our driveway under the glow of a streetlight, watching, waiting, and somehow finding his way back into our lives long after we thought he was gone. For a 6-year-old kid, that wasn't just a scary memory. It became the nightmare I never completely forgot. The first story showed how a simple knock could be part of a planned break-in. The second revealed a stranger who somehow ended up inside a family's home. The third proved that sometimes the people watching your house aren't as far away as you'd like to believe. But this final story might be the most unsettling of all. Because unlike the others, nobody ever discovered who was outside. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was identified. And to this day, the person responsible remains a complete mystery. This happened almost 3 years ago while I was serving a full-time mission in a small town in Idaho. The area was quiet. The kind of place where everybody seemed to know everybody else. Nothing major ever really happened there. At the time, I was living in a house with my companion, Spencer. One evening, we were both relaxing after a long day. Nothing unusual was happening. No strange noises, no suspicious vehicles. Just another ordinary night. Then, I heard it. Knock. A single tap against the kitchen window above the sink. I looked up immediately. Outside was nothing but darkness. For a second, I assumed it was probably a tree branch. Maybe the wind had blown something against the glass. That explanation made perfect sense, at least until it happened again. A few moments later, another knock came from a completely different part of the house. This time, it was the laundry room window. That got my attention. Before I could even process it, another knock came from the living room window. The one closest to where I was standing. Now there was no doubt. Someone was outside, and they were moving around the house. Fast, my heart immediately started racing. The fact that the knocking was moving from window to window made it feel deliberate, like somebody wanted us to know they were there, like they were playing some kind of game. I jumped up and headed toward the bedroom. Spencer wasn't far behind. We locked the door and started trying to figure out what to do. The entire situation felt wrong. Every instinct was telling us that whoever was outside wasn't there by accident. Then things got worse. The knocking moved again. This time it wasn't coming from a window. It came from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Each sound echoed through the house. We sat frozen, listening. Neither of us wanted to answer it. Neither of us wanted to look outside. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. Then came the moment neither of us will ever forget. A knock suddenly hit the bedroom window, right beside us. The blinds were closed. We couldn't see who was there, but whoever it was had somehow moved from the front door to the bedroom window. That realization sent a chill through both of us. Someone was circling the house, watching, following our movements, and staying just out of sight. At that point, Spencer grabbed his phone and called our landlord. Thankfully, he answered. After hearing what was happening, he didn't hesitate. He told us he was on his way. Then he added something that made us feel a little safer. He was bringing a shotgun. Those next few minutes felt incredibly long. Every creak in the house sounded suspicious. Every little noise made us jump. We kept waiting for another knock, waiting for a window to break, waiting for something worse. Finally, we heard a vehicle pull up outside. A few moments later, our landlord knocked on the front door and identified himself. The relief was immediate. We quickly let him inside. He listened to our story and then told us something interesting. As he approached the property, he had seen a pickup truck speeding away from the area. He hadn't been able to identify it, but it definitely caught his attention. At that point, the three of us decided to search outside. Armed with flashlights, we carefully circled the property. Snow covered the ground around the house, making it easy to spot any recent activity. Within minutes, we found evidence that somebody had definitely been there. Footprints. Lots of them. The tracks completely circled the house. Every window, every wall, every corner. Whoever had been outside had walked around the property repeatedly, studying it. Watching it, the strangest part was what we didn't find. There was only one set of footprints. One person, not multiple people, just one. That meant a single individual had managed to move around the house quickly enough to create the illusion that someone was everywhere at once. The realization was deeply unsettling, because it suggested intent, planning, purpose. This wasn't random behavior. This person had deliberately moved from window to door to door. For reasons we still don't understand, we searched the entire property. Nothing. No person, no vehicle, no additional clues. Just footprints disappearing into the snowy darkness. Eventually, there was nothing left to do but go back inside. The rest of the night passed without another incident. No more knocks, no more sounds, no explanation. And that is exactly what makes this story stick with me. Years later, I still have no idea who that person was. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know whether they were planning a break-in, trying to scare us, or simply enjoying the fear they were causing. There was never an arrest, never a suspect, never an answer. But out of everything that happened that night, one thought continues to bother me more than anything else. When I first heard that very first knock on the kitchen window, I immediately looked outside. I saw nothing but darkness. At least that is what I thought. But now I am not so sure, because if the person was standing close enough to knock on the glass, then they were close enough for me to see them. Which means there is a very real chance I looked directly at the stranger responsible, and never realized they were staring right back at me from the darkness. 4 stories, 4 different homes, 4 terrifying reminders that sometimes the scariest sounds aren't screams, alarms, or breaking glass. Sometimes it is something much simpler. A knock at the door, because once you hear it, you never really know who is on the other side.